Duke and the Mystery of the Silent Field When Love Transcends Life and Death. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The evening air was crisp in the quiet town of Willow Creek, where the leaves of the old oak trees whispered in the gentle breeze. Henry Wilcox, a retired carpenter in his 70s, sat on the porch of his modest farmhouse, gazing out at the fields. Life had slowed down after his wife passed, and the only thing that kept his heart from breaking was Duke, his loyal golden retriever who had been his companion for over a decade. Henry had rescued Duke as a pup, and in return, Duke had rescued Henry from the depths of loneliness. But lately, Duke had been moving slower, his once vibrant eyes dulled with age. Henry refused to acknowledge what he knew deep inside time was slipping away for his old friend. One afternoon, as Henry took Duke out for their usual walk along the winding trail behind his home, Duke lagged behind. Henry turned, his heart tightening at the sight of Duke struggling to keep up. "Come on, boy." "Just a little further," he urged, patting his thigh. But Duke merely wagged his tail weakly, his legs trembling beneath him. Then, with a quiet whimper, Duke collapsed. "Duke!" Duke's breath was labored, his chest rising and falling in shallow movements. Panic surged through Henry. "Stay with me, buddy. Just stay with me." The moments stretched on, heavy with an unbearable silence. Then, Duke let out a final breath, a soft exhale that seemed to carry Henry's very soul with it. The weight of grief pressed down on his chest, and a tear slid down his weathered cheek. He lowered himself to the ground, draping an arm over Duke's still body. "Don't leave me, boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. The wind picked up, rustling the trees around them, and for a moment the air shimmered with something unexplainable. A golden hue bathed the clearing, as though the setting sun had bent its rays just for them. Henry felt a strange warmth spread through him, and then Duke stirred. Henry gasped, sitting upright. The dog, who had been lifeless just moments before, let out a small, confused whimper and lifted his head. His eyes, no longer cloudy with age, gleamed with a youthfulness Henry hadn't seen in years. "Duke?" His voice was barely above a whisper. He reached out, hesitant, afraid that if he touched him, the miracle might shatter. But Duke nuzzled his hand, tail wagging as if nothing had happened, as if he had never left. Henry sat frozen, his mind struggling to make sense of what had just occurred. Duke stood up with ease, his legs no longer frail, his movements fluid and strong. He barked a sharp, clear sound that sent a shiver down Henry's spine. This wasn't just recovery. This was something else. Something impossible. As they walked back home, Duke trotted ahead, his energy unshaken, while Henry moved with hesitant steps. His heart pounded with the weight of the unknown. What had he witnessed? What force had brought Duke back? That night, as Henry lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the golden light, felt its warmth wrapping around them. He ran a hand over Duke's fur, feeling the strong, steady rise and fall of his chest. Morning came, but Henry's questions remained unanswered. He took Duke back to the trail where it had happened, standing in the very spot where he'd sworn he'd lost him. The wind whispered through the trees again, carrying with it a soft, unspoken reassurance. And Henry, a man who had once thought he had seen all that life had to offer, found himself believing that maybe, just maybe, some mysteries weren't meant to be explained. They were simply meant to be cherished. The morning sun cast golden light through the thin curtains of Henry Wilcox's bedroom, stirring him awake. His mind was still tangled in the strange events of the day before. Duke, his loyal German shepherd, had collapsed, lifeless in his arms only to rise again, brimming with unnatural energy. Henry turned his head, half expecting it to have been a dream. But there Duke was, lying by the bed, his chest rising and falling in steady, rhythmic breaths. He looked different, stronger. His once graying fur now gleamed, his muscles more defined. Henry's brows knitted together as he sat up, rubbing his face with calloused hands. Was it even possible? He reached out, hesitating before his fingers brushed against Duke's coat. A strange, tingling sensation ran up his arm, like static electricity. Henry jerked back. "Duke," he murmured. The dog's ears twitched, and he lifted his head, amber eyes locking onto Henry's. But there was something else there, an awareness that went beyond an ordinary dog's gaze. A flicker of something deep, something knowing. Henry swallowed hard. "You gave me a hell of a scare yesterday, buddy." Duke tilted his head, almost as if he understood. Then, suddenly, he rose to his feet, his tail stiff and body alert. Without warning, he bolted for the door, scratching at it frantically. "What's gotten into you now?" Henry muttered as he got out of bed, the cold wooden floor shocking his feet. He swung the door open, and Duke shot outside, dashing across the dew-covered grass toward the woods behind the house. Henry hesitated only a moment before grabbing his boots and following. The morning air was crisp, filling his lungs with every hurried breath. Duke had always been obedient, but now he was running with a purpose, leading Henry somewhere. The old man's legs burned as he kept up, pushing through the undergrowth and following Duke into the heart of the forest. Twigs snapped underfoot, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. Then Duke stopped. Panting, Henry stumbled to a halt beside him. They were in a small clearing, a place Henry hadn't visited in years. The wind picked up, rustling the treetops, and Henry felt a chill crawl up his spine. The ground was disturbed. In the center of the clearing were odd circular burn marks, dark against the grass. They weren't natural. Henry's breath caught in his throat. What in the he trailed off, stepping closer. Duke remained still, staring at the marks with an intensity that unsettled Henry. The old man knelt and reached out to touch one of the burn spots. As soon as his fingers met the blackened earth, a jolt shot up his arm. He gasped, stumbling backward. Duke whined, pacing anxiously. Henry's heart pounded in his chest. "What is this?" he whispered. The air around them seemed charged, almost electric. He looked at Duke, who was standing tall, ears perked, muscles tense. Then, a sound, a faint humming, almost like a whisper threading through the trees. Henry's breath quickened. Was someone out here? He turned, scanning the woods, but the sound wasn't coming from any single direction. It was everywhere. Duke let out a sharp bark, breaking the eerie silence. Then, without warning, he bolted again this time, towards something just beyond the clearing. Henry hesitated only a second before running after him. His pulse thundered in his ears as he followed Duke deeper into the woods, past familiar landmarks that now seemed foreign. Then, suddenly, Duke stopped again, standing at the edge of another clearing. Henry slowed to a walk, stepping cautiously forward. His gaze landed on something he couldn't quite comprehend. There, in the center of the clearing, was an old rotting tree stump, except it wasn't just a tree stump. It was pulsing faintly, as though something beneath it was alive. The ground around it bore more of those dark, burned marks. The air shimmered slightly, distorting the space around it. Henry's mouth went dry. His instincts told him to turn back, but his curiosity kept him rooted in place. "What the hell is going on?" he murmured. Duke took a step forward, then another, his body low to the ground like he was tracking something unseen. Henry followed, feeling the strange energy intensify as he neared the stump. He knelt, hesitating before pressing a hand to the bark. The moment his fingers touched it, a low vibration shot through his body like a pulse of energy. The whispering grew louder, surrounding him, consuming him. He yanked his hand back, gasping. Duke growled softly, his ears twitching. Henry's mind raced. What had he just felt? And why did it feel so familiar? He stared at the stump, then at Duke, who was watching him intently. A slow realization crept over him. This wasn't just a strange phenomenon. This was connected to Duke's impossible recovery. Something had happened here, something beyond explanation, and Henry wasn't sure he was ready to find out what it was. But he also knew he couldn't ignore it. The night was still, the wind whispering secrets through the trees as Henry Wilcox sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the slumbering form of Duke. The German shepherd's chest rose and fell steadily, his fur glinting under the dim light from the bedside lamp. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had shifted in the world he thought he understood. His thoughts kept returning to that clearing, to the burnt circles in the earth, to the pulse of energy that had crawled up his arm when he touched the ground. It wasn't just strange. It felt otherworldly. And Duke wasn't the same dog who had collapsed in that field. He was something else now, something more. If you're still watching this story, drop a 1 in the comments to let us know you're here. Henry exhaled sharply, running a hand through his thinning silver hair. He needed answers. With a quiet groan, he pulled on his boots, grabbed his flashlight, and slipped out of the house. The cool night air bit at his skin as he stepped onto the dewy grass. Duke stirred but did not wake. Good, Henry thought. If something dangerous was waiting for him in that clearing, he didn't want his old friend caught in it again. He made his way down the familiar path, past the tall pines that had stood sentinel on his property for longer than he had lived there. The forest was eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an expectant hush that sent a shiver down Henry's spine. As he neared the clearing, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The air was different here. He could feel it pressing against his skin, an unseen force that made his pulse quicken. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the burned patches in the earth. He sucked in a breath. They were still there, and in the center of them, his heart nearly stopped. A stone. Small, smooth, and faintly glowing with a golden light. Henry's fingers twitched. The last time he had touched something in this clearing, he had felt that strange energy pulse through him. And yet, he couldn't stop himself. He crouched down, hesitating for only a second before picking up the stone. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of warmth spread up his arm, not unpleasant, but strong alive. His vision swam for a moment, and then a voice. Not words, not exactly, but something that pressed into his mind, leaving an impression, a feeling, a question. Do you remember? Henry's breath hitched. He staggered back, dropping the stone. It hit the ground with a soft thud, its glow pulsing slightly before settling. His mind was racing, trying to latch onto what he had just heard or felt. Do you remember? Remember what? His hands trembled. This was impossible. He had spent 70 years on this earth, and not once had he encountered anything remotely like this. But then again, Duke had died in his arms and come back. Something was happening. Something bigger than him, bigger than anything he had ever known. The wind picked up suddenly, swirling around the clearing. The trees groaned. The shadows seemed to shift. And then a sound. Low, distant, almost like a growl, but layered with something else. A whisper. Henry's pulse pounded in his ears. He wasn't alone. With a sharp intake of breath, he grabbed the stone and shoved it into his pocket before turning on his heel and hurrying back toward the house. His legs, stiff with age, protested the sudden movement. He needed to get out of there. Now. Behind him, the whispering grew louder. The wind howled. The trees seemed to close in. Then, a bark. Loud, sharp. Duke. Henry barely had time to register the sound before a shadow darted toward him from the woods. His heart nearly gave out, but it was Duke, sprinting toward him, his eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. Duke Henry barely got the word out before the dog skidded to a stop beside him, turning to face the clearing with bared teeth, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. Henry didn't dare look back. "Come on, boy," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Let's go." Duke didn't move at first. His body was tense, his ears pinned back. Then, slowly, he turned, pressing close to Henry as they made their way home. By the time they reached the house, Henry felt as if he had aged another decade. He slammed the door shut behind them, leaning against it, breathless. Duke stood by his side, his body still rigid, still listening. Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out the stone. It was warm, still glowing faintly. And in his mind, the question lingered. Do you remember? Henry didn't. But something told him he was about to find out. Henry Wilcox sat at the edge of his bed, the soft glow of the stone illuminating his weathered hands. His breath was shallow, heart hammering against his ribs. The question that had whispered through his mind, "Do you remember?" echoed still, an enigma clawing at the edges of his consciousness. Duke lay by his feet, watching him with eyes that seemed too knowing, too aware. Henry clenched his jaw. He was too old for this kind of nonsense. And yet, the stone's warmth pulsed in his palm, like a living thing, stirring something deep inside him. Taking a shaky breath, he reached for his old notebook. With trembling fingers, he began to sketch the burnt circles he had seen in the clearing, carefully tracing their patterns. The more he sketched, the more uneasy he felt. The symbols, because that's what they were. Symbols, not just random scorch marks, felt familiar. Like he had seen them before, long ago, in a dream or a memory. "What are you?" he murmured, staring at the stone. No answer, just the steady pulse of its glow. Morning came, but Henry had barely slept. He sat on the porch, sipping coffee, his notebook open on the table beside him. Duke sat alert at his feet, his ears twitching at every small sound. The dog was tense, watchful. A car rumbled up the gravel driveway, snapping Henry out of his daze. It was his neighbor, Jack Carter, a man who had lived in Willow Creek nearly as long as Henry had. Jack climbed out of his truck, adjusting his cap. "Mornin', Henry," he said, his gaze settling on Henry's tired face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Henry huffed, rubbing his eyes. "Not far off." Jack frowned. "Heard some strange noises near the woods last night. Some kind of wind, but different." He hesitated, then added, "You ever see anything weird out there?" Henry stiffened. He glanced at the notebook, then at Duke, whose ears were now pinned back, eyes fixed on Jack. The German shepherd let out a low growl. Henry hesitated. He could dismiss it all, chalk it up to an old man's restless mind. But something told him Jack had felt it too. "I found something," Henry admitted slowly. "Something I can't explain." Jack's gaze darkened. He stepped closer. "Show me." Henry led Jack inside, placing the stone on the wooden table. Its glow had dimmed in the daylight, but it still radiated a strange warmth. Jack reached out, but the moment his fingers brushed the surface, he yanked his hand back as if burned. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, shaking out his hand. "That thing's got some kind of charge to it." Henry nodded. "And that's not all." He flipped open his notebook, showing Jack the sketch of the burned circles. "I found these in the clearing, and when I touched the stone, I heard." He hesitated. How could he explain the whisper in his mind without sounding insane? Jack studied the drawing, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he said, "I've seen this before." Henry's stomach dropped. "Where?" Jack exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Years ago. My granddaddy used to tell a story about something like this. Said there were places in these woods where the earth wasn't normal. Said people used to see lights, hear things that weren't there." He looked at Henry. Said some folks disappeared. Henry swallowed hard. "Disappeared?" Jack nodded. "Not many believed him. Just an old man's tales, they said. But I never forgot." He tapped the notebook. This looks exactly like what he described." Henry's fingers curled around the edge of the table. A part of him had been hoping this was all in his head. But now it was real. Too real. Then, as if sensing the shift in their conversation, Duke let out a sudden bark, jumping to his feet. Henry and Jack whipped around. The air in the room seemed to tighten, pressing against them. Then, from outside, came a sound. A whispering wind, carrying something with it. A melody. Low, haunting, and undeniably calling them. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't over. The stone, the burned symbols, the voice in his head. Something wanted him to remember. And he wasn't sure he wanted to find out why. The night was quiet, but Henry Wilcox's mind was anything but. The journal trembled in his hands as he flipped through its delicate, yellowed pages. His late wife's handwriting was still as elegant as he remembered, looping and graceful, yet filled with urgency. The words on the page sent a chill through him. There are places where the veil is thin, where the energy of life lingers, refusing to fade. I have seen them, felt them, and I know they are watching. Henry swallowed hard. His wife, Mary, had always spoken of things beyond understanding, things he had dismissed as superstition. Now, after everything Duke's impossible recovery, the whispering wind, the strange glowing stone, he wasn't so sure anymore. Duke, resting at Henry's feet, let out a low growl, ears twitching. Henry stiffened. The air in the room felt heavier, as if something unseen had slipped inside. "Easy, boy," he whispered, but his voice felt too small in the thick silence. His eyes darted back to the journal. There were sketches of symbols, ones eerily similar to the burned circles he had seen in the clearing. Beneath one of them, Mary had written, "The marks of the call." His pulse quickened. He had read those exact words earlier, in Jack Carter's old folklore book. Something deeper was at play here, something Mary had known about long before he ever set foot in that clearing. He flipped another page, his breath catching at what he saw next, a rough sketch of a stone, nearly identical to the one in his possession, with a note scrawled beneath it. "If found, it will awaken what sleeps. But beware, nothing returns without purpose." A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, making Henry jolt. The stone, sitting on the nearby table, pulsed faintly, as if responding. Duke shot to his feet, growling toward the darkness beyond the window. Henry followed his gaze, his blood turning to ice. A figure stood at the edge of the pasture, barely illuminated by the moonlight. It wasn't moving, just watching. Henry's breath came in short, uneven bursts. His instincts screamed at him to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen it, but he couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, heart hammering. The figure raised a hand and pointed. Not at the house. Not at Henry. At the stone. Henry's grip tightened on the journal. The message was clear. Whatever force was tied to this stone, it was here and it was waiting. Duke's growls deepened, his body coiled and tense. Henry could feel it too, an energy pressing down on him, filling the room like an unspoken command. The words from Mary's journal pulsed in his head. Nothing returns without purpose. With a shaky hand, Henry reached for the stone. The moment his fingers made contact, a powerful wave of heat surged through him, not painful but overwhelming. A whisper curled through his mind, soft, fragmented yet unmistakably urgent. "Remember." The world around him blurred. A rush of images flooded his mind, memories that weren't his. Voices speaking in languages he didn't understand, flashes of light, of people, of places long forgotten. And at the center of it all, a single burning truth. This had happened before. Not just to him. Not just to Duke. To others. Through the haze of visions, one thing became clear: this stone, these symbols, the strange energy pulsing through the air. This was no coincidence. It was part of something much, much older than him, something buried beneath time itself. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the vision snapped away, leaving Henry gasping, his knees buckling. The stone, now cool and lifeless in his grip, had gone dark. The presence outside was gone. Duke whined, nudging Henry's trembling hand. He steadied himself, his pulse still racing, his mind reeling from what he had seen. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't done with him yet. Taking a deep breath, Henry straightened. He grabbed his coat, slipped the stone into his pocket, and gave Duke a reassuring pat. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "We've got work to do." As he stepped out onto the porch, the night stretched before him, vast and unknowable. The wind carried a whisper, just faint enough to make him doubt he'd heard it at all. But he had. "Do you remember?" Henry Wilcox's fingers trembled around the stone, its golden glow pulsating like a heartbeat. The whisper of the figure's words lingered in his mind. "You are the key." But what did that mean? What was being asked of him? Duke, standing beside him, let out a soft whine, nudging Henry's leg with his nose. His warm amber eyes were filled with something Henry swore looked like understanding. He clenched his jaw, his heart pounding like a war drum against his ribs. The night air pressed around him, thick with something unseen, something ancient. The figure stepped closer, becoming more solid, more real. It was neither man nor woman, neither young nor old. Its very presence defied the rules of existence. The golden light radiating from the stone reflected in its hollow gaze. "What was lost can be restored," it said again, its voice low and steady, filled with an eerie certainty. "But it is you who must decide what that means." Henry swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He looked down at Duke, his companion, his savior, his old friend, who should not be standing here. A terrible understanding dawned on him. "Are you saying he wasn't meant to come back?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer, but its silence said enough. Henry turned to Duke, his knees weak. The dog was whole, vibrant, stronger than he had been in years, but it wasn't natural, was it? This place, this energy, had changed the order of things. "I almost lost him once." "I can't do that again," Henry murmured, his voice breaking. The figure remained unmoving. "Everything comes at a cost." The words hit Henry like a hammer to the chest. He staggered, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The whispers in the wind grew louder, curling around him like unseen fingers. Duke let out a sharp bark, as if trying to bring Henry back from the edge of his thoughts. The old man's breath shuddered. He had spent so many years in solitude, mourning loss after loss, Mary, his friends, even pieces of himself. Duke had been the one constant, the only thing keeping the silence from swallowing him whole. But the stone's energy wasn't infinite. Something had been taken from the balance of the world, and now Henry had to decide, would he keep defying nature, or would he let go? He looked at Duke again, feeling an unbearable tightness in his chest. The dog watched him, head tilted, waiting. Henry's hands clenched into fists. He didn't want to say goodbye. He knelt down, pressing his forehead gently against Duke's. "You've been my best friend, boy," he whispered, voice trembling. "But I think you were supposed to rest." Duke didn't resist. He just let out a soft sigh, his body warm against Henry's. It was as if the dog already knew, like he'd been waiting for Henry to realize it too. Tears burned in Henry's eyes as he turned back to the figure. "If I do this, will he be at peace?" The figure nodded. "He will be where he belongs, and so will you." A lump formed in Henry's throat, but he swallowed it down. His fingers, shaking, reached for the stone. It pulsed violently now, as if sensing the decision being made. With one last deep breath, he stepped forward and placed it in the center of the circle. The ground trembled beneath his feet. The golden light surrounding them intensified, engulfing Duke, the field, the very air around them. Henry shielded his eyes as the energy swirled, growing brighter and brighter until a deafening silence. Henry blinked, his vision struggling to adjust. The glow was gone. The stone lay dull and lifeless in the dirt. And Duke. Henry turned sharply, his heart lurching in his chest. Duke was lying in the grass, still and peaceful. His body was warm, his fur ruffling in the gentle breeze, but he wasn't breathing. The old man knelt beside him, his fingers running through the familiar coat. His chest tightened, his vision blurred. Duke had been given back to him once, but Henry had made the choice. He had set things right. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he cradled the dog's head one last time. "Thank you, boy," he whispered. "For everything." The figure was gone. The night was still once more. Only the distant sound of the wind remained, as if carrying Duke's spirit away to where he truly belonged. Henry sat there for a long time, the weight of his decision pressing against his heart. And yet, despite the grief, there was something else. A quiet peace. He had remembered. And at last, he had let go. The golden light had faded, leaving only silence in its wake. Henry Wilcox knelt in the empty field, his hands trembling as they rested on Duke's still form. The warmth of the dog's fur remained, but the steady rise and fall of breath had ceased. A lump formed in Henry's throat, but he didn't fight it. The tears came freely, hot against his weathered skin. He had made the choice to set things right, to return what had been borrowed. And now, Duke was at peace. A gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the grass, carrying whispers that only Henry could hear. Not words, but something deeper, something ancient. He lifted his head and saw the figure standing at the edge of the field. It was fainter now, almost blending with the night. "You have done what was needed," the figure's voice murmured, a sound like leaves drifting on the wind. "The balance has been restored." Henry swallowed hard. "Then why does it feel like I lost everything?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering his words. Because love leaves an imprint, even when it fades from sight. Henry's fingers curled into the grass beneath him. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, but alongside the sorrow, something else settled inside him, a quiet understanding. Duke had come back to him once, not as a mistake, but as a gift. A final journey together. And now, Henry had given him the peace he deserved. The figure took a step back, its form dissolving into the night. He will always be with you. And just like that, it was gone. Henry exhaled, his breath shaky but steady. He reached down and ran a hand through Duke's fur one last time before standing. The stone lay beside him, now cold and lifeless. The glowing energy that had once pulsed within it had vanished, leaving behind only a small, unremarkable rock. He picked it up and slipped it into his pocket. With one last look at the field, Henry turned toward home. The stars stretched endlessly above him, and though his heart ached, he walked forward knowing that true love never truly fades. Even beyond life. The story of Henry Wilcox and Duke is more than just a tale of mystery and sacrifice. It is a reflection of life's inevitable truth. Nothing lasts forever, and love sometimes means letting go. In our modern world, we often find ourselves clinging to things that are meant to pass, whether it be relationships, careers, or even the past itself. Like Henry, we fear loss, and we struggle with the idea of setting something free, even when we know deep down that holding on may cause more harm than good. One of the most profound lessons from Henry's journey is the acceptance of change. He had to confront the reality that Duke's miraculous return was not meant to be permanent. In our own lives, we encounter situations where we wish we could freeze time, whether it's wanting to keep a loved one close, fearing the unknown of a new path, or resisting the natural transitions of life. But as Henry learned, love isn't about possession, it's about appreciation, understanding, and allowing things to follow their rightful course. Another takeaway from the story is the importance of listening to the unspoken. Throughout his journey, Henry was surrounded by signs, whispers in the wind, the glowing stone, and the restless energy of Duke. In today's fast-paced world, we often ignore our own intuition, dismissing gut feelings and inner voices that guide us. Yet, just like Henry needed to acknowledge the truth in front of him, we must also take the time to reflect and listen to our emotions, to our instincts, and to the lessons life subtly teaches us. The concept of balance also plays a crucial role in the story. The figure in the field spoke of restoring balance, reminding us that nothing can be gained without something being given in return. This speaks directly to how we live today. We chase success, wealth, and happiness, often at the expense of our well-being, relationships, and personal peace. However, true fulfillment comes from understanding that every gain comes with responsibility, and every decision has consequences. Finding harmony in our actions, being mindful of what we sacrifice, and understanding the cost of our choices is what ultimately leads to peace. Finally, Henry's journey teaches us about the endurance of love. Though Duke was no longer physically present, Henry carried him forward, not in body but in memory and spirit. In life, we experience loss of people, opportunities, and even parts of ourselves. Yet, just because something ends does not mean it ceases to exist. Love, kindness, and the moments that shape us remain with us, influencing who we are and how we move forward. Instead of dwelling on what has been lost, we must honor those experiences by continuing to live with purpose. The story of Henry and Duke reminds us that love, in its purest form, is about understanding when to hold on and when to let go. It teaches us that listening to the world around us, finding balance in our lives, and embracing the inevitability of change are all necessary for growth. Most of all, it reassures us that nothing truly disappears, it simply transforms, living on within us in new and unexpected ways. So as you navigate life, ask yourself, what am I holding on to that I need to release? What changes am I resisting? And how can I find peace in the natural flow of life? Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.